In my sermon about baptism last week, I made a comment comparing getting baptized to getting married. I said that both of them were exclusive commitments taken for life. It hadn't actually occurred to me at the time that this week we would be hearing about Jesus attending a wedding. The story we heard tonight about Jesus attending a wedding in the town of Cana only appears in the Gospel according to John. And it's something of a surprise how it comes up because it's almost out of the blue. John's gospel starts with all that kind of philosophical stuff about Jesus being the Word who was with God in the beginning and being the Word who became flesh and moves into our neighborhood, as Karen put it so helpfully for us 2 weeks ago. And then Jesus is baptized by John, and some of John's followers start following Jesus. And then all of a sudden, here we are at a wedding. We're never even told whose wedding it is. Apparently, that's not the point, which may be a big disappointment to the couple themselves. I've been thinking a bit about weddings recently. Most of you know that I teach a course on conducting weddings as part of the marriage celebrant training for the Baptists, the Churches of Christ, and the Christian community churches. And in my position on the board of the Open Baptist, I'm involved in helping to ensure that Open Baptist pastors will continue to be licensed to conduct weddings. So those things have me thinking about weddings at a more kind of formal bureaucratic level. But I've also been thinking about weddings at a more personal level. Not only have Rita and Frank asked me to conduct their wedding later this year, but a number of Acacia's cousins and friends are getting married. Some of those weddings I'm conducting and some I'm just attending. At one, I was supposed to be just attending, and then I ended up coming off the interchange bench as a replacement celebrant because the intended celebrant didn't finish the required training in time. The last few years have been pretty interesting time to be thinking about weddings because marriage has been something of a political football in the culture wars. Australia has had its painful same-sex marriage debate, which is done and dusted in the civil realm, but continues to tear churches apart. One of the consequences of that debate was that so much angst was expended over whether the definition of marriage could say that it was between two people or only that it was between a man and a woman, that among far too many people, everything else about the definition of marriage has been forgotten. We know it's about coupling up, but giving it any more thought than that has become rather unfashionable and rare. I notice more and more that the celebrations surrounding a wedding seem to be becoming astonishingly expensive, kind of a competitive arms race, which couples will spend 18 months meticulously planning. And then almost as an afterthought, they'll give about an hour and a half to planning the actual wedding ceremony and the lifelong vows that they're going to make to one another in that ceremony. And believe me, the impact of those vows is going to last way longer than anyone's memory of how your wedding celebrations measured up to the escalating expectations. I attended 2 weddings in November, and at a guess, I'd say that one of them cost about 30 times as much as the other. And yet it seemed to me that the budgets made very, very little difference to the celebratory spirit and enjoyment of the 2 weddings. They were both lovely and everyone present had a great time. And the 2 couples are certainly just as married as each other now. Now, to be fair, whatever my personal biases may be, the account of Jesus attending the wedding in Cana gives absolutely no attention to the wedding liturgy either. The main story happens entirely within the context of the wedding feast, an event which in that culture quite likely went for several days and may have been just as socially competitive as today's weddings. Now, there are preachers around who will try to argue that the presence of Jesus at this wedding is somehow an endorsement of their particular view of traditional marriage. But given that neither the identity of the couple nor the content of the liturgy were considered relevant to the points the gospel writer wished to make, that seems awfully far-fetched. It's not too far-fetched, though, to note that John, the gospel writer, has deliberately presented us with a baptism and a wedding as the opening scenes of Jesus' ministry. So even before I get to the water into wine thing, I feel that it's warranted to come back to the point I made last week. Baptism and marriage have some important things in common, and it's to do with commitments or vows taken for life. Now, in religious circles, the monastic traditions have tended to swallow up our understanding of religious vows, so that if anybody talks about religious vows or living a vowed life, the images that most often come to mind are people joining religious orders as nuns or brothers or monks. What has unfortunately been lost is the older understanding that that was just one of several pathways of vowed life. The more important and all-encompassing one was commenced in baptism and was the vowed life for all Christians. For those who marry, additional religious vows are taken, committing two people to a lifelong relationship of trust and intimacy. The thing that is so often forgotten is the purpose of these vows. What is the point of making lifelong vows that commit us to certain ways of life? Why not just leave all the options open and live with the freedom to do whatever we like at any given point in our future? Now, I want to get into the water into wine story to properly answer those questions, but the short answer is that it has to do with depth. We can go deeper when we commit to sticking at something. If you want to dig a really, really deep hole in your backyard, you will get a lot deeper by committing to keeping on digging in the one place rather than digging a bit here and a bit there and a bit all over the place. So even if I believed that no religion was better than any other, I'd still argue that you can achieve a much deeper and richer spirituality by committing yourself wholly to the practice of one than by trying a little of this and a little of that and never really mining the depths of any of them. Now, the main focus of this story of Jesus at the wedding is his response to the anxiety over whether there will be enough food, enough wine, enough love, maybe, enough anything. We're only 3 sentences into the story when Jesus' mother says they haven't got enough wine. I reckon that the anxiety over having enough is one of the big subconscious things that underpins the competitive arms race of wedding planning. If we're trying to launch a wonderfully successful marriage, will this be enough? You sometimes see this in a more explicitly manipulative form around funerals, where profit-oriented funeral salespeople will ask you whether perhaps your loved one was worth a more lavish and expensive coffin. Is this really enough to show how special they were to you? And when we come back to weddings, I'm sure you've heard speculation about whether the size of a diamond ring was enough to demonstrate a love that could last. Is it enough? They've got no wine. There's not enough. Not enough. It's an anxiety that most of us know in one area of our life or another. For some, it's not enough to put food on the table, not enough to keep up with the costs of housing, clothing, and feeding a family. For others, it's not enough time, not enough energy, not enough health, not enough emotional resources. For those at this wedding, it's not enough wine to meet the social expectations of appropriate hospitality at a wedding. Just like people now, with the ever-escalating expectations of how lavish a wedding should be, there was a lot of anxiety about measuring up here, and running out of wine would be seen as a horrible faux pas, a total embarrassment, a lasting social shame. Never mind that the guests had been drinking for several days and were well and truly drunk. because it wasn't about having enough to quench anyone's thirst. It was about enough to meet the social expectation of lavish and excessive hospitality, of making it a real wedding. When Jesus produces more wine, what he is responding to and saving the hosts from is their potential humiliation. As much as people like me who like a drink or three might like to appeal to this story as a sign of Jesus's enthusiasm for alcohol, that's not really the central point of the story. And yet, the scandalous aspect of it is certainly not being downplayed. The stone water jars that he produces the wine in were therefore a ritual hand washing that was an important part of good social behaviour. Not washing your hands as expected would have been seen as rude and uncouth and disrespectful to those around you. A bit like an uncovered cough in a crowded tram during the height of COVID. But at this wedding, if you just want to wash your hands, you can't, because Jesus has filled all the hand basins and the sanitizer bottles with wine. So not only is Jesus responding to the anxiety about enough with an outrageous abundance, but he's disrupting some of the social niceties in the process. If you thought that keeping yourself nice was what will make you a good person, Jesus has just poured wine all over your best clothes and pushed your head into the chocolate fountain. But in a funny, it is so scandalous and over the top above to the idea of making vows to live. Central thing that was taking place at this wedding. And pretty fashion. It is seen as excessive and unnecessary. It's a bit primitive, unenlightened, and uncultured. Even wedding vows are dismissed by many as nothing more than an unnecessary piece of paper. And many of those who do marry seem to not understand what vows are. At more and more weddings, I hear so-called vows that are a romantic gush of lovey feelings with little or nothing that actually resembles a vow, a commitment for life. It's like they're saying, I'm with you as long as I continue to feel this way. But the way these stories unfold at the start of John's Gospel is telling us that Jesus is both calling us to something more extravagant than that and promising us that the rewards will flow abundantly beyond anything we could imagine. So we have the story of the baptism with the commitment of the first disciples reminding us what our baptismal vows are committing us to. And then we are immediately with Jesus at the wedding feast, where the water of anxiety is turned into the wine of ridiculously abundant blessing, so extravagant that it feels irresponsible and scandalous and wasteful. Why waste the best wine on this drunken mob? Asks the steward. Our nagging questions are real. Is there enough? Will there be enough? Am I enough? Can anything be enough? Come and see, says Jesus with a laugh. If you trust me enough to give yourself to me for life, to follow me with wholehearted commitment, you will see how rich and deep we can go. Fill these stone jars with your anxieties, with your fears of not enough. Fill them to the brim. Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. And right here at this table, you will know enough and far, far more than enough, outrageously more than enough. Right here with the rich wine of God's love. Let the celebration begin.